Hello, I'm the Reverend Gregory Milliken, the current priest and vicar of Grace Episcopal Church in New Lenox, Illinois. This year, 2018, marks our 150th anniversary, a huge milestone for any Episcopal church. For over a century and a half, this congregation has shepherded a worshiping community from the old Methodist house to its current Prairie Gothic structure on Pine Street to a modern worshiping community in the southwest of Chicago. So join me now as we look back over the 150 years and reminisce and reflect on the great people and events that have made up the wonderful history of this place. From the days when the priest rode in on horseback to the annual carnival festivals in the community, from the famous ham dinners to the Morning Star mission drives, this is Grace New Lenox. The story of Grace Church begins not in New Lenox, but Tracy, Illinois. This was the name of the village originally in this area just east of Joliet in the early 19th century. At the request of its namesake local railroad engineer John Tracy, the town was rechristened New Lenox after Tracy's original home of Lenox, New York. The mostly rural farmland was marked by its train stop and its depot, which stood at Cedar Road and Route 30 until just this past year. Though there was an existing Episcopal church in nearby Manhattan, Illinois to the south, the developing community decided to organize a mission of the then Diocese of Illinois in the burgeoning village of New Lenox.
One of the challenges for me when I arrived here was the fact that New Lenox doesn't really have a downtown. It was really hard to sort of figure out, where is New Lenox? Frankfort had a downtown, Mokena had a downtown, Joliet had a downtown, New Lenox, not so much. Grace being an historic building, I mean, clearly this was at some point the epicenter of something, but so very difficult to see. And there wasn't like there was a coffee shop you could walk to. There wasn't a centered place. It felt much more diffused.
The first worship service of Grace Episcopal Church, as it was to be called, occurred on November 22, 1868, in the long since gone early Methodist Church building, located originally on Hickory Street, closer to Cedar Road. Construction began on the church sanctuary as we know it soon after, and on September 4, 1870, Grace held its first worship service in the building at 209 North Pine Street. The building was still being finished, and there was just a brief pause for morning prayer before getting back to work to complete the project. Grace's iconic sanctuary is the oldest structure in the village of New Lenox that has been continuously used as a church. It has been restored a number of times to keep it protected from the elements and the wear and tear of time. The design was inspired closely by a similar church in Davenport, Iowa, from renowned architect Richard Upjohn. Its bell tower was added a few years later. The style is called Prairie Gothic, evoking the classic Episcopalian cathedral-style nave, but while maintaining a rural Americana feel to the overall design. The church was literally graced with some wonderful people who helped establish the church, becoming key worshipers and pillars of the community. These included most especially Caleb and Alice Jones, who donated the bell tower in memory of their mothers. The Jones children included Bessie, Laura, and Lee Jones, who continued their parents' tradition of raising their families right here at Grace. The Gauger family, longtime New Lenox residents, have made Grace their home for over a century too. And the Batson family rounds out the other major pillars of the church that continue its lineage right down to current family worshipers. Grace has had over 30 official clergy to lead the congregation, beginning with the Reverend Sam Cowell. Cowell and several of his successors would also serve the parish of St. Paul's, Manhattan, which eventually was closed in the 1960s. One of Grace's favorite clergy was the Reverend Charles Hodge, who, much like Grover Cleveland did for the United States presidency, served 2 non-consecutive terms. When Father Hodge returned to Grace in 1900, he brought with him his growing family of children. Father Hodge's family set the pace for Grace to be one of the most welcoming places for our littlest worshipers. From its earliest days, Grace was a family church with children always present in worship and in and around the buildings and grounds.
My inclination was that I wanted my daughter in church. I want kids in church. And so how much more important to have children from infancy onward be integral parts of the life of the congregation and to delight in their exuberance. I would do children's conversations before my homily. I would sit on the step and call the kids up. I had so many parishioners say, you know, I get more out of your children's sermons than I do out of your regular sermons. And I'm like, thank you, I think.
One of my fondest memories of the kids was on Easter morning. We always overfilled. So much so there was standing room only and all the kids had to come up. So all the kids would leave their parents and come up and sit around where I was sitting and just kind of like be everywhere. Like they would sit next to me and then like on the floor and then they'd like spill over. And I love that.
Throughout the years, it has always been the community and the fellowship that has driven Grace. In the early 1900s, Grace gathered the New Lenox and Southland communities for a carnival, complete with rides and treats and booths. This tradition lasted for decades. By far the most famous community event centered at Grace was its ham dinner. For many years, Grace's dedicated parishioners would pull off a massive public dinner complete with spiral ham, a unique raisin coleslaw, and twice-baked potatoes. Grace's people handled everything, and as the years wore on, the ham dinners became a huge source of revenue for the church, with people even taking their meals to go.
Organized chaos. It was a wonderful thing to do, but trying to seat as many people as we did. I mean, I think we would serve well over 200 or 300 people for lunch, and the space seemed always inadequate. And so by the time the ham dinner ended at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, everyone would be completely exhausted. And every year there was the inevitable conversation, shall we do it again? People would be here who were here every year, but that was their connection. That was their connection with Grace Church. It was something the community planned around.
Grace continued its vital worship through the tumultuous years of World War II, and that would set the tone for other conflicts to face the nation and the world on Grace's watch.
We did a service that night for 9/11. Actually, on that day, I was on my way into Chicago. I took the train as I always did, and with every stop, and there were plenty between here and Chicago, as people got on, there was this buzz. You know, people weren't being the quiet commuters they usually were, sort of like, did you hear, did you hear, did you hear? We got into Chicago, and the train immediately turned around. I mean, we were not allowed off. And all of the financial district was streaming onto the train. And it was standing room only. And I had my prayer book with me. The people that were around me said, "Are you a minister?" And I said, "Well, yes, I am." And they said, "Would you pray with us?"
Reverend Summer also had the dubious honor to preside at Grace during one of the closest and hotly contested presidential elections in our history.
The 2000 elections were interesting because Grace is a diverse congregation in terms of where you are politically. I mean, there were yellow dog Democrats and there were, dyed-in-the-wool Republicans. And, it was a small enough place that y'all knew who each other was. And everyone worshiped together. The friendships and the connections go so deep that you know that somebody sees things differently than you, and you love them anyway.
Sometimes the conflicts were right here within our church walls, signifying major theological and political differences.
Every church has its thing. And I remember having some very impassioned conversations with George Cook, who was one of the people who was passionate about the American flag being in the worship space and about, that the First Amendment guaranteed freedom of religion and we need to honor that. And me equally passionately saying to George, the symbol of the church is the cross. In this sacred space, we need to be real clear about what are the dominant symbols of our life together.
Grace weathered so many storms and challenges, growing and adapting through the years with changing times and attitudes.
I was the first woman vicar of Grace Church. I think it's been my lot in life to be the first woman something or other in every church I have served. A number of the women of the congregation would find an opportunity to tell me what it has meant to them to have a woman vicar. And to have a woman say the body of Christ, and to have their vicar be a mom.
But also trying to contend with the realities of caring for a building and grounds passing a century of existence.
The infrastructure was really in bad shape. There's no other way to put it. But combined with that, we began to grow. And as we began to grow, we needed more space. And the Undercroft area was completely underused because it was wet all the time, and it sometimes had 4 to 6 inches of water in it. And it was Bill Sikowski. And Bill was the one that said, what about the possibility of putting a new foundation underneath the church? And that began a lot of the dreaming about what that space could look like. But I remember him being out here every day with the backhoe operator saying, this is my church. You better not touch it the wrong way. It gave us the space to begin to introduce catechesis to the Good Shepherd, to continue to develop our youth program.
We were worried about the floor. The floor was creaking, and especially around the altar, it felt like at any moment I would just from behind the altar. And so we decided, well, let's really take a look at things. And I remember we were sort of all gathered around, and we pulled up a corner of the carpet, and we realized, like, this is all original, like, hardwood floor. Like this old house kind of, and so we just sort of went for that. We painted, we brightened it up. We were trying to restore it to sort of its original, because we had the original floor, so it's like kind of a reclaiming of the original feel of this country church.
Through updates and changes, Grace boomed in the 1990s and 2000s, even if the ham dinners were a thing of the past. It grew particularly in outreach ministry.
One of the wonderful things we did was we had developed a youth group. One of the first things we did was a mission trip to South Dakota. I had a classmate who had just been recently consecrated as Bishop of South Dakota. He connected us with a Native American reservation in South Dakota, and off we went with a van full of kids. One of the things we did that week was we painted this little Episcopal church, painted it white, and then painted a red door on it, on the reservation. One of the boys says to the girls, he says, that red door is so red you can see it from outer space.
But perhaps the most important piece of the history of this place is the people who have filled its pews and parish hall and classrooms for over a century and a half.
Mary Morris. Mary was the matriarch of the congregation. And when I arrived, I'm guessing Mary was in her 70s, and when I left, she was probably in her early 80s. But Mary was a force to be reckoned with in a very, very positive kind of way.
She was a wonderful woman. She was the heartbeat of this place, and when she died, it was as though one of the pillars had fallen. She was a significant person in the life of this congregation and had been for a great many years. Let me tell you about Ed and Marilyn Johnson. Motorcyclist Ed was one of those rare guys who was as at home with the orthodontist who bought the Harley as he was with the outlaw biker guys. I mean, he could seamlessly travel between these groups. And when he died on his motorcycle, we had a biker funeral. We had a biker funeral at Grace, that was the biggest thing we'd ever had. I think at Grace, I think it may still hold the record. We had about 250 people, if you can imagine. Most of them wearing leather on that day. And a procession from this space to the cemetery that involved, I don't know how many bikers that couldn't even fit into the church. It was standing room only, and it was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. Yeah, biker funeral.
We did a baptismal pool party for Jesus, in which, everybody else gets a baptismal party and a cake, so we thought we need to do that for Jesus, because it was January and we were all a little down, and so we paired up with St. Benedict's Bolingbrook. But I have to say, the most of the people who came to said pool party were from Grace, where we blessed the waters. Heidi and I did, and we had the whole place to ourselves, which was lovely. But my favorite part was, as I'm watching the kids and I look over and almost all the adults are just chilling in the hot tub. There was just a Grace hot tub that was just happening. That was just something to behold, indeed.
One ministry that has become an iconic and enduring legacy at Grace is its banner guild, now officially called the Liturgical Arts Society. For several decades now, these volunteers have tirelessly sewed and quilted distinctive, beautiful, and memorable banners to adorn the sanctuary and facilities.
I think it's a remarkable thing for a church to have 150 years under its belt. I think in general that's an astonishing thing. Grace New Lenox predates the formation of this diocese, and I think it made Grace strong. And I think that they began to understand many, many, many years ago that their identity was them and not the priest who led them. Nobody ever said these words to me at Grace, but I was always aware that they were here long before I arrived, and they would be here long after I left. My sense of Grace when I arrived here was that they were a hidden gem. My fear for Grace is that they will continue to be a hidden gem. I want this part of the world to know this place. I want them to walk in these doors, and I want them to fill these pews cheek to jowl. And I want it to grow, because there is such a powerful, sweet, sweet spirit in this congregation. And it truly has transformed lives. It has transformed mine. It started my daughter off into a very faithful life as a young adult. It got my husband to church. This place is amazing. More people need to know about it.
Thank you for joining us on this trip down memory lane. And as the people of Grace prepare for the next 150 years, we want to thank all of those saints and loved ones who have supported and cared for this church over its first century and a half. And of course, to God be the glory. May all of us continue to celebrate our amazing Grace.